Well, welcome to another session. In today's session, the theme would be on the adjustments that have to be made as part of your initial offer proposal to a seller for a purchase of a property that meets your requirements. In the prior session, we concluded with a list of adjustments that should be made to the external part of the building. Remember, I started by saying that when you view the property, one of the things you've done as part of your viewing is to carry out an inspection, and that there was a purpose behind the inspection. One of the outcomes you were hoping to obtain from your inspection was to ascertain the amount of deferred repairs and the associated costs with such repairs that were outstanding. The principle being, or the point being, if a property is listed for, in this case, £250,000, it's a house, but the property is in really poor condition externally, then as part of your purchase process, the first thing is to establish whether that price incorporates the current condition of the exterior part of the building, including the ground and the various parts of the plot. The second stage, and this process was what we covered in the prior session, but the second stage of your adjustment process was to go internally. So the first was the external, and let me go a step back. If the external condition is not reflected in the price, I suggested and recommended that you have to ensure that you itemize and calculate all of the repairs that will be needed to bring the external condition up to par. If you estimated that this would be £50,000, then that would mean that you should start looking at the sale price based on its adjusted calculation as opposed to its original listed price. The second stage will be to look at the internal parts of the building. In this case, from my experience, most properties that are sold through agents usually reflect, the price of the properties are usually reflective of the condition of the internal parts of the building. This applies primarily and mainly to leasehold properties. So if this was an original building designed as a single dwelling home, but it was converted to two units, to two flats, a ground floor flat and a first floor flat. If you were buying the first floor flat, usually the agent who is representing the seller would normally reflect the condition of the internal parts of the house in the listed price. So most of the time, you do not have to carry out adjustments. Sometimes you do, most of the time you don't, because the agent is intelligent enough to recommend to the seller to choose a price for which they believe they would be able to attract a willing buyer to make an offer. Most agents do not want to waste their own time. So if the owner wants the property sold at, say, £250,000, but the agent believes that based on the condition of the flat, £20,000 needs to be spent to upgrade, they would recommend to the owner to do the upgrade themselves, and then they can market the property at its improved price. On the other hand, if the owner is reluctant, then usually the agent will recommend to the owner that it's best for the price to be reduced from 250 down perhaps to £230,000 to attract enough potential buyers. In today's session, I will be focusing on the inside, what I call internal adjustments that have to be made as part of your appraisal and pricing process. Like all purchases in relation to properties or real estate, the sales price of a property should normally reflect its current condition. Again, where it doesn't, it's up to you as the buyer to carry out the estimated cost for such works and the time. I have been speaking a lot about cost, but you must also connect this to time. You should allow for the cost and the time to bring the building up to modern standards. So for example, let's say the £50,000 was for the external. But if it took you 6 months to carry out the works and you completed the purchase, let's assume in this case, this building was being purchased with the aid of a mortgage. And let's say that your mortgage payment was £1,000 per month and the bills for the house was £270 per month. This would mean that every month you have a carrying cost per month. This is what your carrying cost would be, 1,270. On the other hand, if you were buying the property to rent and the rental price for properties is 1,005 and you had a cost of roughly £80, the difference between these two is that the cost would include the basic costs the landlord has to be responsible for: insurance, ground rent, and any contractual costs linked to the ownership. But the utility cost, the operating cost, will be borne by the tenant. In this case, you're looking at £1,580. If it takes you 6 months to complete the works, then it's 6 times 1,270 if this was a property you were buying to use yourself. But if this was a property you were buying as an investment, then this is the opportunity cost. So 6 times 1,850. So let me just do this very quickly. 1,580 rather. 9,480. $7,620. This is the carrying cost. So as part of your analysis, I'm going to bring in the additional costs based on the time premium and also based on opportunity loss. So for freehold buildings, for freehold properties, again, the sale price should reflect the entire building. But if it's a leasehold property, what tends to happen is that the cost will normally include or will normally be reflective of the interior of the property only. You have to then establish what the pro rata share of the cost for the exterior works would be. That was where we got to in the prior session, and that brings us nicely into today's session. Without going over the same thing over and over again, it's important to keep in mind that when a building has a dated interior, and I know that the concept of dated furnishing is a subjective view, we still can apply objective standards. But if the property has a dated interior, you should make the necessary allowances for a full refurbishment, and then ensure that the cost for such refurbishment is reflected in the overall purchase cost. So if, let's say, Mrs. S was buying the first floor flat, and she established that it would cost to her 20,000 to upgrade the interior because it was very dated and maybe some dilapidation in some areas, then as part of her negotiation, she has already recognized that there is a £50,000 cost for the external works. Because it's a leasehold property and she's sharing with one other person, she would only incur one half of the £50,000 plus 100% of the £20,000 for the interior, in which case it's 25,000 plus 20, which is £45,000. The property is listed for £250,000, less 45,215 would be where she should start her negotiation with regards to the right price to pay. As part of her £20,000 for the interior, let me share some, though not all, but let me share some of the items to consider as part of your calculation, because most people ask the question, well, how do I know what allowances I should make? The first thing to keep in mind is to always budget for the cost for the removal and disposal of any fixtures, fittings, equipment that are left in the property. This is why when you buy a property, you should always state as part of the purchase through the agent that you want everything removed from the property. Now, certain things will not be removed, such as the carpets. Sometimes the white goods may be left, the reason being that the seller does not want the headache of having to do all of that. But you should state that so that when you arrive, you're not having to pay someone for the disposal, for the removal, the dismantling, removal and disposal of old furniture or old items left by the prior seller. So include in your budgeting the cost of removal. Include in your budgeting the costs for any repairs, any redecorations of especially the communal areas. So this is a 2-unit house. There will be a communal area. Those communal areas could be internally or it could be externally. For example, it could be a shared garden. It could be a shared alleyway. It could actually be a shared interior hallway. It could be where the gas meters are located if they are positioned internally. It could also be the refuse housing. It could be things such as the fence, which is shared. So make an allowance for all of those costs for the communal areas. Repairs and redecoration. Allow for the cost for a new bathroom, a new kitchen, a new heating system, new flooring, new ceiling, for repainting the flat completely, for any upgrade to the electrical services or electrical system or the gas installation. These upgrades are necessary and sometimes are mandatory if it has to be done to meet a safety regulation or a standard. Make allowances also for the replacement of all single glazed windows or doors and the replacement of the locks to the main entrance door. For example, the main entrance door to this flat, the locks should be replaced, or the door ideally replaced. The reason, like I said in one of the prior sessions, is that sometimes over a certain amount of time, what you find is that so many people have lived in that property or have had access to that property, and so you're not really sure who has the keys. Now let me assume that Mrs. Sam is a single woman, and although she's on the first floor, I'd like you to consider that what if the ground floor has a private entrance and the first floor has a private entrance from the side of the building. So it's a maisonette. Both are maisonette. They have their private entrances. It means that if she were on the first floor, on the ground floor, if someone was trying to get into the flat, they can do so without necessarily being a nuisance to the other building users, which means security and safety for Mrs. Sam or Ms. Sam will be paramount, in which case she should replace the door, not just the lock. She needs a new door to make sure that it's been fitted well. Now, if the cost of replacing the door is too high, she can always get the door inspected by someone. They can check to see that the door frames are still fit for purpose. They can replace the locks. Sometimes, let me give you a good example. Sometimes you might find a door has been used and that's the lock. It has a lock. Sometimes you don't have to replace the door. You can get a tradesperson to come down, unhinge the door, turn the door upside down. They can take out the old lock. They can fill the hole and do it very well completely. They can sand it down on both sides, and then they can repaint the door. But before they repaint, they can then install a new lock so that there are no holes and it looks like a brand new door. This is just a refurbishment of the existing door. Now, when you've done all of this, you would have an idea about the total cost for the works. I have used an example already. I've said, let's assume this will cost £20,000. Now let me bring back my calculator so I can show you the importance of this. Now you would find normally that any deferred costs, both internally and externally, once you've aggregated the entire cost, in this case is £45,000, this can amount to a significant, sometimes up to 10-15% of the purchase price. Or if it's a very poorly maintained building or a dilapidated building, it could even be as much as 20%. Using this example, the property was listed for £250,000. If you divide 45 by 250, you have 18%. This is why it's very important to go through this exercise, because 18% of the cost just to get the property up to standard, 18% relates to costs that the existing seller should have paid for, but didn't. I stated that usually with property sales, most buyers try to maximize as much cash flow from their properties, and they defer maintenance as much as they can, with the idea and with the intention that sometime in the future they can sell the property to someone else for the highest price with all the deferred costs included. Your responsibility and my responsibility is to ensure that we do not allow ourselves to transfer 18% of our wealth based on the purchase price to the seller. So we're looking to negotiate. This means that if you had estimated that this 250 price was actually the right value for the property, you would want £45,000 removed from the price to reflect all of the costs that the owner should have paid before they sold the property. And therefore your negotiation would begin at the rate of 205,000. That's where you begin your negotiation. I said 215 here. That's a mistake on my part. So keep that in mind. 18% is a lot of money. Now, as you can imagine, when you approach the seller to discuss the possibility of reducing the price, this will not be received very well. The conversation will not be easy. But you have to have some conviction. You have to have some conviction in your and belief in yourself, and recognize that a negotiation is necessary. Now, let me give you an example. In almost all of the instances that I have been involved in, every time this has been brought up, the seller usually refutes the claims. They state, several things as to why I'm wrong. Obviously, no one wants to be told that they've done a poor job with maintenance of their own property. I'm normally very steadfast. I'm normally very firm. My offers are normally non-negotiable if I believe that the seller is not being reasonable. Like I try to be very reasonable. I will raise issues that I believe should have been dealt with. General wear and tear is understandable, but failure to deal with planned and preventative maintenance is not something I'm willing to bear myself. If I'm not getting the property at a price that reflects all of those costs that I would have to pay myself. So in my experience, I would imagine that if you bring this forward to the seller, they're very likely to move to someone else who they believe will not be as critical as you have been. I always try to be very transparent. I try to be transparent in my dealings with, and I try to do so in a professional manner with the seller. And one of the ways I do this is and this is how I recommend you proceed, is by providing the necessary evidence to support your claims. Whenever I have done this in the past, in most of the cases, in majority of the cases, the sellers have conceded. But their concessions requires some level of tactful negotiation. You cannot go in too hard. You have to, in principle, understand what the seller's needs are, make them understand yours, and then try to come up with a trade-off that both parties are happy to accept. In this example, £45,000 may have been what you've decided is necessary. You might negotiate that down to £40,000 or £39,000. One of the things I have learned when you're negotiating with numbers, with people, is to don't round up numbers, round them down. So, for example, if you were going to negotiate a £5,000 decrease, rather than say, I would accept £40,000, say I would accept £39,000. There's something that happens mentally with people when you round down. This is the reason why we have the 99p shops. If you said to people, it costs £1, psychology and the evidence from psychologists and behavioral statisticians, they have shown that you would have fewer purchases of goods priced at £1 compared to goods priced at 99p. It's only 1p difference. So you can say, I'll be willing to accept 39,000 or 39,500. It makes a huge difference because suddenly The seller is not thinking in the 40s. He's now thinking in the 30s, and they tend to take that as a win. So the information I provided so far is not exhaustive. Your building will be different. And therefore, pay attention to the fact that whilst I have made reference to some of the major cost items found in structurally sound buildings, again, everything that I have said so far in this session and in the prior session, when I dealt with the exterior works, everything I've said relates to structurally sound buildings. For buildings which have more severe structural issues, here's a recommendation. Defer to the professional for advice and guidance. My experience has been that, on average, about 70 to 80% of the costs that are listed, all right, let me rephrase that. 70 to 80% of the repair works that are necessary, which were identified by your surveyor, will be based on the external envelope rather than the interior part of the property, especially when we're dealing with period or old buildings. So pay attention to the exterior. Most people do not pay attention to the exterior, which is why over the long term, most people lose money from their property purchases than they do make money. Once you've identified these costs, in this example, I've used £45,000. I have already said you can deduct. Think about how you can negotiate with the seller as to the price to pay. And I said 250 less 45 is 205. Now, you might think that the right approach, once you've identified the cost, or once you've agreed a cost with the seller. Now, for simplicity, let's just assume that the seller agreed that there will be a reduction. But let's say you guys had to negotiate and you settled on 39,000. You would think that the right approach would be for the 39,000 to be deducted from the 250,000 pounds, and that you would pay 211,000 pounds. That would not be applicable to everyone. If you are buying with cash, then this direct deduction approach is acceptable. However, if you're buying using debt or using a mortgage or using a loan or buying through a creditor, in this case, you're applying some debt plus your equity to buy the property. In this case, you should not apply the direct deduction approach. Do not simply deduct. Don't say, well, reduce the price. The appropriate arrangement for you, if you're buying with a mortgage, the appropriate arrangement will be for you to agree with the seller that you would pay the original price, and then negotiate for the 39,000 for the remedial works to be paid back to you directly, either through a rebate or for the 39,000 to be paid when you've exchanged contracts, or for the funds to be placed in a sinking fund, and then you can draw down on these funds when you start the works. And this sinking fund must be established and the money paid in before the contracts are signed. Now, the reason for my recommendations will be provided as we move forward in the next few sessions. I'll go through a detailed approach and I'll show you. I know for some people it wouldn't make sense. You might be thinking, why don't I just simply get the seller to reduce the price to 211,000, and I'll pay 211,000 for the property. Perfectly acceptable if you're paying with cash. If you are a cash buyer, then that's fine. If you're buying with debt, through a mortgage, a loan, then do not apply the direct deduction approach. And I will explain using examples in the sessions to come why it's to your disadvantage if you apply the direct deduction approach. Now, let me conclude today's session by talking about, but you know what, let me stop today. I'll pick it up from another session next time, but for today, I think that would be a good place to stop. In the next session, I'm going to come back and I'm going to talk about how you value on equal spaces and how you adjust the price of a property to reflect the fact that certain parts of the building internally have unequal spaces. I think you'll find it fascinating because this is something that I never see people do. Certainly you have to apply some discrimination in how you apply this approach. But keep this in mind, not all spaces are created equal. As part of your purchase process, you should establish which spaces are what I would consider less valuable and which spaces are considered prime value. For the ones that are less valuable, there should be an adjustment. For the ones that are prime, there should be no adjustment. And once you have carried out this analysis, you would have an idea as to what price you should pay for the property.